Hello and welcome to another edition of Free Spirits, a podcast brought to you by the Freedom Association. I'm Andrew Allison. My guest today is my good friend, Mark Littlewood, who is Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Mark studied PPE at Balliol College, Oxford, and I have to say that that is philosophy, politics, and economics, and not personal protective equipment, just in case anyone is unsure of that. He went on to work for the European movement. He was campaigns director for Liberty, chief spokesman for the No to ID campaign, and even spent some time as head of media for the Liberal Democrats. And what surprised me most, Mark, is that you've actually been the Director General of the IEA since 2009, and I hadn't realized it was that long.
How time flies when you're having fun, hey, Andrew?
Well, you're having a lot of fun, but it's great to see you, albeit virtually. We'll have to have a beer at some point.
Agreed.
Now, you're a lifelong supporter of Sunderland, even Southampton Football Club. I must get that one right.
Yeah.
It's because I was looking through that Sunderland Till I Die thing on Netflix last night. I've obviously got Sunderland on the brain. But it nicely links us into the first topic of conversation, which I think we should say the now defunct European Super League. Which took the world by storm on Sunday night and 48 hours later seemed to have collapsed. Now, I know by looking at your Twitter feed which side you're on, but what do you make of it all?
Well, it's pretty extraordinary. You can definitely tell, you're right, Andrew, from my Twitter feed which side I'm on, but I'm going to try and persuade you that there is at least some nuance to my position, right? As you say, this whole thing looks like it's dead after 48 hours. I saw the comedian Matt Lucas joking that Tottenham Hotspur are already releasing the DVD of their 48 hours in the European Super League, if any fans are interested. But look, on the one hand, as a free market sort of person, I believe clubs, companies and individuals can arrange their affairs as they see fit. So to give an extreme example, I pointed this out in an article for the Telegraph website just yesterday. If Manchester United decide that they no longer wish to play association football, they instead wish to sell tickets to their stadium, Old Trafford, in order that people can watch Marcus Rashford engage in a number of modern dance routines, and they're going to abandon football altogether. Well, I guess Manchester United have the right to do that. Similarly, if Manchester United decide that they still want to sort of play association football, but they don't want to play it in an open and competitive fashion, they essentially want a range of exhibition matches exclusively against Liverpool and Real Madrid, well, I guess they can do that as well. I guess they have the right to make these sort of decisions, but that doesn't mean that the decision itself is a smart one. Businesses and individuals can make damn stupid decisions every day, and they do. I mean, if nobody ever made a stupid decision, probably no business would go bust, right? I mean, errors are made all the time. So, I think in theory, I don't know what all the legal issues are about what the contracts were with the Premier League and UEFA and what had been undertaken, but assuming they were escapable from, clubs have the right to do this. They have the right to go and try and do something else. It's just a damned foolish thing to do. And of course, what's happened is that the collapse of the European Super League, although I dare say it will re-emerge at some point in some zombie-like form, is a triumph, Andrew, of the free market. The free market killed this off in 48 hours. The consumer reaction was so visceral that the producers suddenly realized there is no way we can go down this path. I mean, done instantly. And you might even say brutally. I think for the better, but instantly and brutally. We no longer need to wait for Oliver Dowden's fan-led government inquiry into the future of the sport. So the market, that's to say the consumers, the fans, had a look at this, decided extremely quickly they didn't like it, and the producers have therefore been forced to retreat. So I didn't want it to happen. I think it would have been bad for the sport I love. I don't know whether it would have been good or bad, particularly for my own club, Southampton. Probably bad, but my main view was that I want football to be an open and competitive sport in which teams can go up and down, and this seemed to be a blockage on that. I'm glad so many fans so vociferously took the same position as I did, and we therefore won. A triumph for capitalism against the producer interest.
Yes, we've heard a lot about the pyramid system that we've got in English football, and I'm not a big football fan. I watch England, when they play in the World Cup or the Euros, but that's about as much as my interest in football is. But this pyramid system apparently is not around in other European countries, and that element of competition. I mean, that's the whole point. It's called competitive sport. I look at Hull City, which is not far from where I'm sitting at the moment. They've been, I think, in all four divisions of the Football League and the Premiership in the last 20 years. I mean, they've been in and out of the Premiership. They're currently in League One, but they look like they're going to win League One and go back up to the Championship. And of course, the dream next season is that perhaps Hull City can even make it back to the Premiership again. And that keeps the game competitive. And what I didn't like, and Boris used the term cartel, and it was pretty much a cartel. They were trying to raise probably hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds in extra revenue, which of course would have meant that they could have bought much better players, and then they would have been much stronger in the Premier League, and then they would have dominated the Premier League and made that less competitive. But as you rightly said, the fans actually won this one, and it was a triumph of the free market in the end. But wasn't it such an audacious thing to do? I mean, they didn't even tell players, never mind fans, didn't tell players, didn't tell managers, and they just announced it and thought they could get away with it. It shows how arrogant they are.
You're right. It does show some arrogance, and I mean, you might say, I think you described it as audacious. I think I would just describe it as bloody stupid. Actually,
well,
I mean,
yes, and that
what seemed evident to me, and I mean, the mind boggles about how inept this whole thing was. Is, to put it mildly, the 12 clubs who were supporting this Euro Super League thing had not got their ducks in a row. I mean, to put it mildly, it was evident that they had not squared off the biggest team in Germany, Bayern Munich, and the biggest team in France, Paris Saint-Germain, who are sort of, well, they may or may not join at some future date. There's 3 more places available. They clearly hadn't squared off sort of any of the supporter groups. There's no evidence that Manchester United had spoken to the sort of Manchester United Fans Association and been in consultation with them for months. They clearly hadn't spoken to any of the players or the managers, right? So they launched this sort of, I don't know what they were expecting to happen from a complete, they hadn't squared off any of the journalists. I don't think anyone was asking themselves, what's Henry Winter or Patrick Barkley going to make of this, or Gary Neville or Alan Shearer when they comment about it. So it was bizarre in a way, especially because it was presented as a fait accompli. Previously, they've sort of floated ideas. A little while ago, they floated this idea called Project Big Picture, which was a sort of a blueprint or some suggestions about how football might change. But this was, to all intents and purposes, a declaration of war. We're going to leave the Champions League and European structure, set up this structure ourselves. This is how it's going to work. We've already worked out what the quarterfinals and the semi-finals are going to look like. Extraordinary. And, that they got the backlash they deserved. I mean, I don't think it will end here in 2 ways. Firstly, I think that they have caused their brands and their relationships with their fan bases really devastating harm. I want to say irreparable harm, but they are no longer at one with their fan base. I think there's going to be an ongoing tension. I mean, we've seen that in some of the mega clubs anyway. A small portion, admittedly, but a portion of Manchester United fans have gone and set up a new team called FC United. It's lower down the pyramid, but there's been for some years fans of the mega clubs thinking, I'm not really supporting a club anymore, I'm supporting a corporation. That will worsen it. And I suspect in some form or other, this idea will rear its ugly head again. I mean, although when it hit on over the weekend, it was out of a clear blue sky. It's not as if discussions about a Euro Super League have not been going on for 10 or 20 years. So I'm not sure it's completely over yet, but this will definitely bury it for a good period of time. There's going to be a complete rethink, and they're not going to be able to cook up some madcap scheme like this in the boardrooms again. But you're right, Andrew, about the pyramid system. I mean, the other European leagues do have a form of pyramid system. You can get relegated from the top divisions, but has nothing like the depth of the English pyramid system. You know, our clubs, even in the what used to be called the 3rd division and the 4th division, can get pretty decent attendances, right? I mean, Sunderland are down in the 3rd division, still get a lot of attendances. If you're looking at the Italian or the Spanish or the French leagues, by the time you're even into the 2nd tier, let alone the 3rd or the 4th, it's disappeared to nearly nothing. It doesn't have the level of sort of loyalty, support, and fan base that we've got here in the lower echelons. They're top clubs. You might very well argue are as big as Manchester United and Liverpool and the rest, or near as damn it. But if you were to look at the 50th, 60th, or 70th biggest club in Italy and Spain, there's really no comparison. So, I mean, the fans have won, hurrah for that. But I think it's I think it will rear its ugly head again. And for the 6 English teams involved, I mean, I think they're going to be. I think they've caused themselves really quite serious brand damage, if you like, in economics terms, to, again, in economics terms, their customer base, or their fan base, as we would call it in football.
Yes, I mean, they've certainly insulted their fans by calling them legacy fans. So those people who have faithfully turned up week after week in hail, rain, and snow to support their team, they've been season ticket holders for decades. To be called a legacy fan and to be deemed not important, well, you are. It's not the way to win friends and influence people. No, exactly. when it comes to your fan base. But you say it could rear its ugly head again. Just before we move on, I mean, just one question. It's Boris Johnson, really. Boris Johnson decides to get in and say that the government is going to somehow block this by any means possible, by putting a windfall tax on restructuring. Now, I don't think Boris Johnson knows a damn thing about football. I think he probably knows less about football than I do. But the idea that the government is somehow going to get involved, and they seem determined to continue to be involved. I mean, there's the German system where the fans have controls of 50% plus one, which is probably the reason why the German clubs didn't participate in any of these discussions. But the thought that the government is going to start regulating a sport, I mean, that fills me with horror.
You're right. Listen, and I think that the political reaction to this, it tells a rather sorry story about the state of modern politics, Andrew, because although, you know, my view as a kind of private citizen, if you like, is this is a bad idea. I think this will ruin the game I love. And, you know, please don't do this as a fan or a customer. The idea that it's a matter for the state to pronounce upon how a private or community enterprise organises its own affairs, I consider completely ridiculous. You know what? I would have had so it was virtue signalling, basically. Oh my God, there's a lot of people who are very angry about this. We as politicians need to virtue signal that we agree with them and feel their pain. And there were 2 things about it that particularly irritated me. I think somewhere along the line, even though I'm a non-interventionist, you could potentially, at a rather obscure, detailed and technocratic level, say, oh, well, hang on, this might be an issue for the Competition and Markets Authority. There is the potential here that a cartel is being established. I mean, we as libertarians can have an argument about whether you need competition policy law at all, but you could see the idea as, you know, in the same way that if all of the high street banks sort of entered some sort of cartel arrangement, we might actually say, no, this is undermining competition. So on a very narrow point of competition law, I could just about have understood a politician saying, well, you know, on the face of it, there might be some reasons for the Competition and Markets Authority to perhaps have a look at this. But that's not what they said. Oliver Dowden, the Cultural Secretary, said, we will do, quote, whatever it takes to protect our national game. Not a sort of, we think there might be a case for looking into whether competition law is being breached. We will do whatever it takes. The government will do whatever it takes to protect our national game. I mean, I suggested on social media then that the government should launch a full public inquiry into the current application of the offside rule. I mean, that is a problem in the national game. I'm told by a cabinet minister they will do whatever it takes, quote unquote. Let's have a full public inquiry into the application of the offside rule and how video action replays are being interpreted by officials then. I mean, it's bizarre barking that politicians are going down this route. And as I say, with such hysterical language, whatever it takes, it must be stopped. No stone will be left unturned. And, you know, the other element of it, I don't blame this exclusively on politicians, but, you know, it shows how much work free marketeers have got to do is if you like, what's been blamed here is the greed of the clubs. They're ignoring the fans. They're doing this for greed. Well, how are they supposed to satisfy this greed exactly? I mean, the only way you make money is to provide a product or service to your fans or your customers that they are eager and willing to buy. The idea that the choice that Manchester United have is either to satisfy their fans or to be greedy is completely right. If the people running Manchester United are greedy, they should be thinking every day about how they can sell more things to their fans. This seemed to be, excuse my language, a complete shit sandwich that they were trying to sell. That's not the way to satisfy your greed. And it's almost seemed to emerge that sort of, in some bizarre way, this was never stipulated, but seemed to be the implication that we were going to sort of ignore Manchester United fans and instead just have a couple of boxes of people from JP Morgan watching these games. And that was the sort of greedy thing to do. That's an insane thing to do. If you're not providing Manchester United fans with what Manchester United fans want, exciting live action football, decent stadiums, Sky Sports packages, replica shirts, DVDs and the rest, well, you're not very good at being greedy. So I found this bizarre that apparently the choice was between the club's face was greed on the one hand or satisfying their customers on the other. If you're a greedy person, all you should be thinking about is satisfying your customers. That's the way to satisfy your greed.
I think that these supporters groups that have met with the government, I would just send one message to them: be careful for what you wish for, because I think they're going to get much more government involved here, and they'll be wanting people like us then to fight with them against all of this. So if you're not a member of the Freedom Association, then why not become one today? Go to www.tfa.net and click on the join button at the top of the page. Annual membership fees are £30 with a discounted rate of £20 for seniors. And if you're a student, it's only a £5. But just moving on, the future of the economy. We've been told that 32 people have been hospitalized with COVID after receiving the vaccination. And yet the Prime Minister says it's the lockdowns that have done this. It really has nothing to do with the vaccination program. Then he slightly backpedaled and said it's mainly to do with lockdowns, and the vaccination program has done a little. But he was certainly, in my opinion, undermining the vaccination program. I've had my first jab. I don't know if you've had a first.
Yes, I've had my first as well.
Yeah. I had mine actually the same day as the Prime Minister did,
right,
about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I've got the second one booked in for the beginning of June. But we've got to reopen this economy, and we know it's been reopened at a snail's pace. I cannot see why hospitality could not be open now. It's my mother's 80th birthday on Sunday, and she lives up in County Durham, and I'm actually trying to find somewhere to take her out for Sunday lunch. And it's bloody impossible to try and find somewhere to go. So you can see the hospitality is not reopening at all. But how optimistic are you that once the economy reopens, so we get past the 21st of June, hopefully we have a decent summer season, hopefully the weather will play ball, and everyone will be out and about, and also assuming that many people, of course, who have been furloughed and haven't had to travel to work, haven't had to buy season tickets, have got some disposable income. Do you think the future of the economy is bright in the short to medium term?
Not in the short term, frankly, because what we've done. And I agree with you, Andrew, that I think that we've now got into a position of almost craven caution. It's a great shame that people are still dying of COVID-19, but you have to take a balanced view of what the various numbers are. And I mean, we're getting down to levels that are about the same as the number of people who die in car accidents, and we don't, impose lockdowns on the roads because of that.
Well, more people on Monday, I think, died as a result of a car accident
than died of COVID, right? Yeah. So I think it is an absurdity. You rightly say now that we don't reopen it. And if you remember back in the day, one of the potential strategies abandoned quite quickly was to go for herd immunity. I can remember when I was a kid, my parents were desperate for me to get measles and chickenpox early and young or mumps, I think it was, early as a kid. because it doesn't cause you too much damage as if you're a kid, whereas if you get it while you're going through puberty, it can be a lot more unpleasant. So there was initially this sort of let's go for herd immunity, sort of, lots of, 18 to 22-year-olds getting COVID. I mean, they'll get a bit ill, but they won't die. And although we don't know the exact number, I think it's still being argued about. But at some point, I don't know, 60% of the population, 70% of the population, 75% of the population having had the virus, we've got herd immunity at that point. I must confess, I don't completely understand the science, but if you like, the virus can't survive anymore. There's not enough people to latch onto it because people have had it and have developed an immunity towards it. Well, we can't be that far away from herd immunity now on the vaccination. No. If you were to add together the number of people who have been vaccinated with an additional cohort, people who haven't been vaccinated but have had COVID and recovered from it, I mean, what are we getting? Well north of 40 million now, isn't it? I mean, it's something of that sort of magnitude.
Yeah.
And of course, because of the way the vaccination program has been rolled out, I mean, it won't have been rolled out absolutely perfectly. I dare say there are still some 80-year-olds who've somehow slipped through the net and not had their first jab. But overwhelmingly, we've got to all of the high-risk groups. And the virus is very ageist, right? I mean, it really is. I mean, somebody was telling me the other day, which I find hard to believe, but looking at the numbers, it looks like it might be true. In the UK, the virus has killed more people over the age of 100 than it has killed people under the age of 40. So that gives you an indication. It might even be over the age of 95, but it gives you an indication of how. I mean, you can still get very ill and unpleasant for the under 40s, very much like having flu. You could well be in bed for a few days and feel really grim, but very unlikely you're going to die if you're under 40. And we've now more or less vaccinated everybody over 40. So I'm with you. Why we now can't get back to work? That's what a rational policy would be. The politics of it are, because the government's done sort of in, out, shake it all about. Oh, let's, not lock down. All right, let's lock down really hard. Okay, let's ease it. Oh my God, we're going to need a circuit breaker. I think we're now into the policy being determined by political optics and desperate. Boris Johnson is desperate not to have to U-turn and do a reverse ferret again. And if that means your dear old mum is not going to have the optimal Sunday lunch with you on her 80th birthday, that's pain that Boris Johnson's willing to inflict upon you to make sure that he doesn't have to go through the embarrassment of another U-turn. But
even though she has had 2 doses of the vaccine and is fully vaccinated.
It is truly, truly barking at this point. Surely we're now at the position where people can take their own risks, right? I can understand somebody who is, I don't know, 25 years old, hasn't had it, and says, look, I still want to keep working from home. I don't want to go down the pub yet until I've had my vaccine. But this could now be a matter of personal choice, not state mandate. But all of that said, your question was really about the prospects of the economy and how quickly does it bounce back into life. I've got a mixture of views about this. You said over the short and medium term. Let's take the immediate term first. I think that will be quite good come June the 21st, right? As soon as and I know there's some easing before then, and we've already seen a bit of easing. On the first day, you could drink outside in a pub. Soho here in London was heaving. The same will happen as we go through the additional gates and dates, but let's take, I think it's June the 21st as the supposed time when everything's back to normal. You can go to a nightclub, you can go to a football match, a sporting event, a music festival. There will be huge pent-up demand for that. Having had the most ghastly existential threat to its existence over the past 12 months, the hospitality sector is going to have a brilliant last week of June. I think I can particularly predict that, right? It will now. So we'll see a lot of spending. You're right. People have typically accrued money or at least cleared their debts because they haven't had much to spend it on over the past 12 months. People haven't gone on holidays as much as they would, and clearly haven't gone to the theatre or the cinema. We mentioned football earlier on in the discussion. I've been refunded the near totality of my Southampton season ticket, right? So that's money's just sitting in my bank account rather than having been burnt through in a typical season. So we'll get a boost of activity in sort of June, July. You might even see the domestic tourist market being colossal, because we don't quite know what the travel rules or restrictions will be. So there'll probably be a disproportionately high number of people taking holidays in Cornwall rather than Corfu, right? So all of that looks good for sort of June or July. But then I think things get tricky shortly thereafter. Once people have gone out and had too much to drink several days in a row, the novelty will wear off. And we've still got a colossal number of people on the furlough programme. And the economic plan of the government, and look, there's some rationale to it, I'm not going to completely destroy them for it, was that we need to provide a sort of short-term bridge so that jobs and businesses, which in all normal circumstances would be viable, are, if you like, successfully mothballed for a short period of time, and then can spring back into action as soon as this crisis has passed. You know what, I think for 6 or 8 weeks, that might work. You know, if you have to forcibly close a pub for 6 or 8 weeks, a very popular pub that, you know, does really good trade, you could understand the government saying, right, well, we'll pay your staff most of their salary for the next 6 or 8 weeks, because as soon as we open you up again, you'll be viable. But whether that really happens over the more medium term than the immediate term, I'm not so sure. We probably have, and I couldn't really speculate on the number, but now a large number of zombie businesses and zombie jobs, companies that have been kept alive by furlough, but to all intents and purposes in the real world have gone out of business. There aren't going to be jobs to return to, and having not been able to trade either at all or fully over the past year, they're gone. Because a good number of businesses, of course, you know, operate pretty tight to the margin, right? I mean, you know, a good number of businesses are only barely viable, and that's fine. I mean, you know, not all businesses make colossal profits. If they do, more people enter that sector. So business tends to be sort of nip and tuck about whether it's viable or not. And a year of inactivity, even if supported by the government, is going to mean a good number of those don't survive. Although, if you can remember at the start of the pandemic, Andrew, the aim on the infection rate, the government said, was to flatten the sombrero, right, to spread out. Actually, that's really what they've done for the recession and unemployment. We've sort of flattened the sombrero. If we hadn't had the furlough scheme, a business support scheme, these businesses would have gone bust already. But that is yet to come. So the challenge is going to be, and I don't think the government's really addressed itself to this point, how swiftly can we reallocate all of these workers? I don't mean in some ghastly central planning way that we'll got some government agency telling them where to work, but if the pub that you work for actually has gone bust, or the car wash has gone bust, or whatever enterprise, the bookstore that you work in has gone bust, how quickly can you find another job? Either in a similar or a different sector. That's going to test the flexibility of the British labour market, which by international standards is not bad. We've got a pretty flexible labour market, but that's going to test it a lot. We could have hundreds of thousands, you know, perhaps north of 1 million, maybe north of 2 million people suddenly looking for new jobs. And unless the government has not a plan to give these people government work, but some idea about how the surviving businesses, which will be most businesses, but the businesses that get through this pandemic and are still operational come June the 21st, how are we going to make it easier for them to take on new workers? And unless the government, you know, lowers the burden of regulation and red tape and tax, then I think we're going to have a problem. So I think there'll be a bounce back into June and July, but the long-term scarring of this over the next year or two could be pretty grim.
I was listening to Ian Collins' show yesterday afternoon on Talk Radio, and someone called in who was a senior executive in hospitality. It turned out to be a hotel chain, but he didn't say which chain that it was. But he referred to a hotel that used to employ 75 staff, and they now employ 5. So 70 members of the workforce have been laid off as a result. And he also mentioned about the furlough scheme when it was due to end. So employers then gave their employees redundancy notices and made them redundant. And then the Chancellor of the Exchequer then extended the furlough scheme, which certainly didn't help. I look at pubs and restaurants near me in Beverley, and we're a town, pretty much like central London, actually. There's a similarity here, where everything's packed in quite tightly. And there aren't huge beer gardens, and there isn't a lot of outside space. So most of those businesses are still closed because they have to close. It's just not viable for them to open up for 5 or 6 weeks and have, I don't know, about half a dozen tables. Mm-hmm. The last time I was in a restaurant was on the 4th of November last year. I took my wife out to lunch to a French restaurant nearby. And that was immediately before that November lockdown. Mm-hmm. And the head waiter there didn't think that the business could survive another month. Mm-hmm. So when I see that all these businesses closed, I sometimes wonder, especially when I see huge car parks where tables could probably go into, it does make me wonder whether any of these businesses are actually going to reopen again. And that's what really concerns me. I know, for example, one pub has closed down. I know that's for a fact, but I don't know about the rest. And that's what really comes. I mean, the hospitality and events business really concerns me. I think a lot of other sectors of the economy can recover, but that's the problem area.
But okay, let me try and paint. I don't know how sincere I feel about this, but let me try and at least paint a more optimistic picture, right? Let me give the alternative view. Look, it could well be that a couple of things. It could well be that the Dog and Duck in Beverley was going to go bust anyway, and this is the thing that's put it over the edge.
And we do have a Dog and Duck in Beverley as well.
There you go. Right, there you go. There is actually. There are pubs called the Dog and Duck. It's always the one the example used. I'm glad to know there are some pubs actually called that. So some businesses would have gone bust. Some pubs do go bust every year. We shouldn't consider that every pub that's gone bust is only because of COVID. But the second thing is this, surely, right? That why would we assume? Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, from June the 21st onwards, we're back to normal. People can go and do whatever they want. You can take your mother to whatever restaurant you want to take her to. People can go down to nightclubs. All the rest. Let's assume all restrictions go. Well, surely the Dog and Duck is a viable business again. It might have gone bust, right? It might be that the owner has had to liquidate because he had too much stock or he had a cash flow problem. Okay, somebody else will come in and buy the Dog and Duck. If the demand for the Dog and Duck in Beverley is going to be just as high in July as it was 2 years ago, and if 2 years ago running that pub or hospitality thing was a going concern, then it will be a going concern again. I mean, the most obvious example is cinemas, right? I mean, not a single bum on a single seat in any cinema over more than a year, but one presumes that people are still going to want to go and watch movies. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Odeon might go bust for sake of argument. All of their cinemas are closed down. Damn, we were living close to the line anyway, and I'm afraid without the popcorn sales over the last year, we're having to liquidate. But if you like, the cinemas will then sit there fallow, and someone can pick them up and reopen them, right? Although there's quite a big dislocation effect, I mean, I believe the market works pretty quickly, but I mean, that won't necessarily happen overnight. If there are loads of pubs going bust, looking for new landlords to take them over because they are going to be viable business again, and hundreds of cinemas have gone bust, or theatres or whatever, there'll be a process of the movement of capital and labour to reopen them. But on the face of it, it's not obvious to me that demand, in 2 years' time will be any different to how it was 2 years ago. And if demand 2 years ago was enough for these cinemas and pubs and restaurants to be open, then perhaps in a new guise and under new management, they'll be open again. With one rider, and this is the unknowable thing, have habits irrevocably changed? And I'm really interested in this. I wouldn't say I've studied it in depth, but I've looked at a number of anecdotal examples. How it is often the case that a crisis of some sort speeds up radically what was happening anyway, right? Examples from that we'll see, but could be working from home. That was beginning to become a thing. Obviously, you could see that it's now accelerated to be a real thing, and it will be very, very common, perhaps, for people to work from home 3 days a week and go to the office 2 days a week. And that might have all sorts of knock-on effects. You could actually see that now meaning that, let me speculate, London domestic property prices could fall, because if you're no longer expected to be in the office 5 days a week, well, perhaps you can live up in Yorkshire very easily. Come down on a Tuesday, stay in a Premier Inn in London on the Tuesday night, go back on the Wednesday night. Those long distance commuting might become more viable. Cinemas, which I've just mentioned, will they bounce back into life? Well, maybe. Or has lockdown got people so used to Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, launching actually, movies rather than you having to wait a few months until they've done their cinema run, now straight to your screen. I watched the preposterous but rather fun Godzilla versus King Kong the other day. This would have been a massive blockbuster at the cinema. But now, okay, it's available now. They're releasing it now, just straight to my television set. So maybe that, again, that was already happening. People were tending to, invest more in their quality of their TV sets and signing up to Netflix anyway. It wasn't as if Netflix had no customers before the lockdown. But has that been accelerated? Because these crises often lead people, jolt them into doing things that they were sort of half planning to do anyway, and it sort of jolts them into doing it. My favourite example of that, I think it was about 15 years ago, there or thereabouts, there was an all-out strike on the London Underground, meaning that a large number of commuters had to work out alternative ways of getting to the office. Were they going to cycle? Were they going to take a bus instead of the Underground? Were they going to walk? Were they going to drive in themselves? Were they going to share a carpool to get into work? They were suddenly faced with this problem. Everybody had to find alternative routes, or everybody who was reliant on the tube had to find alternative routes. When that strike ended, however, a good number, I think it was around about 10%, so not everybody, but a good number of people discovered that the alternative routes that they had been forced to investigate were preferable to their old tube route. They'd never thought before, maybe I can take the 72 bus. They just walked onto the District and Circle line and taken it. Having now experienced the 72 bus, they said, oh, that's actually a lot better than the tube. So a good number of people then stuck with, they could have done it anyway. They could have done it before the tube strike. It was the tube strike that, if you like, shook them into a change of behaviour. A good number of them, not everybody. And that might well be true of this as well. Perhaps people will, I've got used to, drinking beer at home rather than down the pub. Maybe I won't go down the pub as much. Maybe my habits have changed. I've got used to watching films at home rather than in the cinema. I've even got used to watching football matches now on television. I love watching football, live in a stadium, but because of the way everything's changed, I've been able to watch every single Southampton game on television live.
Yes.
Now, so I will probably, I'm sure I will renew my season ticket, but I could understand some Southampton fans thinking, well, I've kind of got used to that now. I'll make sure I've got the best Sky Sports package so I can watch all the Saints games, but I won't go down to St Mary's Stadium anymore. So we'll see how those habits change. Maybe it won't spring back to exactly how it used to be. Maybe consumer demand has adapted and morphed in ways that are hard to predict, but I've speculated on a few of them.
There will be a new normal. It won't be quite the same as the old normal, but I do think it's going to be closer to the old normal than some people think. The media market, you've touched on that. That has changed completely. I was looking at some figures last week. I think about 6 or 7 years ago, hardly surprising, virtually no one had a smart TV. It was only about 10-15% of the population, but the vast majority of the population did not have a smart TV. Now that's running now at, I think, 60 or 70%. And I like the fact that I can just watch something when I want to watch it. And I seldom watch something live on a TV channel. It just tends to be on Netflix or the iPlayer or full on demand or whatever, or full. And also, you touched upon sport. I'm a big cricket fan, and the county championship has started. And look at some of the numbers they're getting on their YouTube channels, where they're actually putting a live stream of the cricket match with commentary from the BBC local radio sports presenters. And there are more people watching those live feeds than would ever attend the matches. There was one game, I think it was the Durham-Nottinghamshire game, which I tuned into. It had over the course of 4 days, it had well in excess of 100,000 hits. Jeez. Just on the YouTube. But there's also live feeds coming through websites as well. So the figures are going to be that much higher. Now, do I want to go to a cricket match in April when it's snowing? Or do I actually want to sit in the comfort of my home and watch the match on TV? I think everybody knows the answer. So, but I think when it comes to sport, though, I think people will go back. It's all about the atmosphere, Mark, isn't it? That's the camaraderie. That's what it's about. So I think sport will bounce back pretty well. Cinemas, you mentioned, Cineworld mothballed all their cinemas in the UK. took advantage of the government's furlough scheme, and they seem to be all right, and they seem to be ready to open again. But I was never a great cinema goer anyway. I thought they were starting to price themselves out a little bit too much. I remember seeing the Dunkirk film that came out a few years ago. I was actually with our former chief executive, Simon Richards. I was down in Cheltenham at the time. And he said, I'll take you there, my treat. And I looked at how much he'd actually paid for it for 2 tickets. And it was about 32, 33 quid, which seemed a rather expensive price there for 2 tickets to go to the cinema. So maybe they're going to have to look at their model and offer more special offers, or perhaps offer tickets where you can buy a monthly pass and go as many times as you like. And there's some places do that, but make that more attractive. But then that's just all about good business, isn't it?
That's all about good business, but I would guess, again, I'm speculating here. I'm skeptical that economic forecasting or predicting the future with any certainty tends just to end up with egg on one's face. But the sort of thing that might happen in the cinema, I mean, I can imagine for Dunkirk, or I mentioned earlier, the rather preposterous but extremely fun Godzilla versus King Kong, or the highly successful Marvel superhero movies franchise, or Star Wars films. That's a little bit akin to going to a live sporting event. If it's a big spectacular with huge special effects and people flying around and spacecraft smashing into each other and blowing up, then seeing that in a large auditorium on a huge screen, or Dunkirk even, is pretty spectacular in that.
It was a fantastic film. I mean, it really was. Yeah.
And I can see that watching that on a colossal screen with, unbelievably brilliant surround sound is an enormously different experience to watching that in your living room on your, 40-inch TV set. In the same way that watching a football match live has an atmosphere and a camaraderie that you can't easily replicate by sitting me sitting on my sofa at home and watching it on Sky Sports. And that might be the difference there. But let's take a non-spectacular drama. A kind of, that doesn't have big special effects. That's essentially, a romantic comedy, for example. I mean, you don't really need to go to the cinema for that. I mean, if you want to watch Notting Hill or 4 Weddings and a Funeral, whether you like those films or not, but if you want to watch them, it's not obvious to me why you'd pay 20 quid to watch them in the cinema rather than just watch them at home. There are no big special effects. The surround sound doesn't really matter in the same way. So I wonder whether cinema will become a bit more tilted towards the kind of big blockbuster, whether they'll start bringing in, I don't know, smell-o-vision as well. It'll have to be a bit more like a kind of, a theme park experience rather than it just being, well, I'm here to watch it because it's not going to be on the telly for 6 months.
Well, you never know what they may bring in. I mean, the fact that we're talking now on Zoom, most people have never heard of Zoom at this time last year. Now Zoom's all over the world. I mean, I'm still amazed by the radio, to be perfectly honest. How does this radio signal come through? Never mind the television come through. The whole thing just amazes me. But it's the sort of thing that we've got to get used to. If you're not a member of the Freedom Association, then why not become one today? Go to www.tfa.net and click on the join button at the top of the page. Annual membership fees are £30 with a discounted rate of £20 for seniors. And if you're a student, it's only a £5. Just before we finish, because I promised you up here that I would finish on time, I just want to look at sort of the state of freedom in the UK. Cancel culture. Are we truly free? I mean, just forgetting COVID. Just let's pretend that COVID's never happened. What is the state of freedom in the UK? There was a poll that came out a few weeks ago that said that the majority of people felt they were less free now, irrespective of COVID, than they were 5 years ago. An increasing majority of people are now frightened to speak their mind, just in case the police come knocking on their door. Do you think that this is a fad? I mean, particularly cancel culture. Do you think it's a fad? It's been going on for quite a while, but it's eventually going to fizzle out. Or do you think it's, which we have to fight against, of course, yes. Or do you think this is a really serious problem and it's not going to go away?
I think it's a serious problem. And I don't think it will fizzle out to that extent. I don't think it's a fad.
Well, I agree with you.
But I think we're close to there being a serious backlash against it. That your average Brit is beginning to think, with this up, I will not put. This is ludicrous. I mean, it's worth saying that these sort of trends have been with us for some considerable time. I mean, it sort of used to be considered, political correctness gone mad. That used to be the terminology. Now that's sort of morphed into cancel culture, but seems to me to be part and parcel of the same sort of trend, that you don't say these things, it might offend people. Do say those things if you don't want to come across as a racist. Here's the dilemma I've got there, Andrew, that obviously we can all say, and everybody does, freedom of speech, very important, extremely important. But I think we've got to, and we've just set up a new unit at the IEA to look into this problem. I think we've got to really rethink the intellectual framework for freedom of speech. I'm not saying abandon it. I'm not saying cave in to the people who want to cancel us. But I do think we need to think it through. Because let me give you an example. I don't believe in untrammeled free speech. It's easy to say that one believes in it, but often free speech comes up against property right issues, right? If you want to come around to my living room, there might be particular codes of conduct that I expect you to abide by, otherwise I will kick you out. So let's look at universities, for example. Now, it's a complex model because universities aren't really private institutions, right? They suck off the teat of the state. They got sort of state support. But let's imagine a university that's a wholly private institution. Is it any of my business or yours whether they have cancel culture, whether they refuse to allow certain speakers to take to the stage, whether they refuse to allow certain opinions to be broadcast or discussed? I mean, if they don't, I think, like the European Super League, they will fail as a university, because I don't think there's a great deal of demand for people spending £9,000 a year just in the fees, and then God knows what the living costs are, and leaving after 3 years 75k or more in debt just to have been treated like a snowflake for 3 years. I don't think that's why people want to go to university. I think the demand is for listening to conflicting opinions and a battle of ideas. I loved being at university. I was taught by Marxists, Keynesians, conservatives, libertarians, all sorts in between. There was a whole plethora of different views. I loved it. I didn't want to be taught by people who wholly agreed with me. I wanted to be challenged. And that's when I did actually start changing my mind from being a kind of soggy wet social democrat into being a free market libertarian. It was going through that process because my soggy views were challenged. So if a university says, no, we're not having anybody from the IEA here, well, is that any different from a bookstore selling more copies of Marx than they sell of Hayek? I mean, I don't think the state should regulate that bookstore. It annoys me a lot. I always, when I'm in a bookstore, go and look at the economics or politics section. On the economics section, I always have my head in my hands. Why is there so much stuff about Keynes and not enough stuff about Austrian economics? But that's up to the bookstore. If I don't like that bookstore, I'll go elsewhere. So I think there's quite a lot of thought that needs to go into this. I mean, the statues thing is another, I mean, that seems to sort of flare up and has diminished a little bit. But what is a libertarian or pro-freedom view on how we should decide what statues go up in the public square? Who should decide? Whose property is it? What might trigger a statue coming down? And I think you might go down, I've floated the idea that we should go down a full-scale privatisation route here. That the problem here is that it isn't private property. There's a tragedy of the commons going on. So why don't we just have a bidding war? And I'm pretty confident that the people who are fans of Winston Churchill will raise enough money to keep his statue up in Parliament Square. But if the great British public in their wisdom decide they would rather pay for a statue of, I don't know, the Spice Girls, so be it, right? I mean, why don't we allow market mechanisms to operate here? So although I'm worried culturally about how things are going, and I think we are in danger of all becoming too diplomatic in our lives, thinking twice before saying nothing, and not having an honest exchange of views in the workplace or in the media, because we fear that if we say something that's interpreted in the wrong way, it's career ending. And there doesn't seem to be sufficient forgiveness for people making a misstep. If you say a word slightly out of context, that's it, you're sacked from Sky Sports and you'll never work in television again, or you're sacked from this job and you'll never work in television again. Oh my God, this person suggested Donald Trump might have not been too bad a president. Get rid of him. So that I do worry that we're in danger of not having culturally a free exchange of ideas. We're far too worried about offending each other, or whether the police will come round and tap us on the shoulder and say this needs to stop. And there are some things the state clearly needs to remove. I mean, I still can't get my head around the what is it? Hate non-crimes or something? Is it?
Yes, a non-hate crime incident or a hate crime incident.
But they're not crimes.
Or a hate incident. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
It's not a crime. By definition, the police should not be dealing with this, right? I mean,
but the danger of that one, Mark, is that it turns up on a DBS check. Mm-hmm. So if you have an enhanced disclosure, something that you've said that someone didn't like, and they decided to report it to the police, and the police just say, well, no further action, but they mark it down, then that's with you for the rest of your life.
I agree. And this has got out of control. I think if I recollect now, isn't it called a non-crime hate incident?
Something like that, yes.
But by definition, the first two words there, non-crime, mean that the police shouldn't be anywhere near it. I mean, what are the police going to do next? Tell me that, I need to get a haircut? That I shouldn't swear as much, that I should stand up straight. I mean, the police aren't there to enforce manners. They're there to prevent crime and solve crime. And that just seems to me absolutely extraordinary, that in any circumstance, a police officer could come around your house and have a sort of word in your shell about something you might have said on Twitter that definitely isn't a crime, but you we don't really think you should do that. I find that genuinely sinister. We do need to break out what are crimes and what aren't, and the police should only be involved in what crimes are. So I think there's a lot of work to do here, because freedom of speech is under attack, or rather it is becoming harder and harder in our culture to express views without potential fear of penalty of some sort. And I think that's an unhealthy environment. I like the robust exchange of views. And I hope we find some way, because for all of the wonders of modern technology, me talking to you via Zoom now, and the ability of people to produce their own internet content, the IEA now almost sort of runs its own TV channel. It's a small TV channel, but we're able to do that on YouTube, as are, many, many thousands of others. All of that's great. But perhaps it's having the undesired effect of us all being in our own echo chambers. That, 20, 30 years ago when I was at university, I was basically almost the last year to go to university before email took off and before the internet took off. I'd sort of left university, and that was when sort of, oh my God, that's what a website is it? We didn't have any of that. I was the last pen, write your manuscript by pen and read books and read newspapers. And that at least meant, I'm not saying we should go back to those days, but that at least meant there was some sort of public square. You got a variety of views. I would go to the student common room, and I would, to see what had happened in the world, I would sort of read The Guardian and The Telegraph. And now there's a danger that all I do is to go to libertarian websites that reaffirm my view. I never hear the social, or even on a kind of cultural level. I would always look at the sports pages in the hope that I might find some scrap of information about what was happening at Southampton Football Club. Now, no, well, I mean, there are websites devoted morning, noon and night to the comings and going at Southampton Football Club. So I read now much, much more about Southampton Football Club, but consequently much less about sport in general. Your point that you were just making about county cricket being on YouTube, that's probably the sort of thing I would have picked up from a sport newspaper. Now, just sort of narrowly, Southampton Football Club, that's my sport thing, that's what I focus on. Now, I'm not saying that we should legislate against that or stop it or, force people to listen to or go to websites that they disagree with or are interested in. I just wonder whether that's part and parcel of what's happening. We're no longer in a public square. We are in our own niches. Narrowcasting is replacing broadcasting, and that we can't undo that. We can't unblow that whistle, and we wouldn't want to. But I think it's important to be conscious of it. And I actually think folk like you and I, we probably agree on 80 or 90% of things. But folk like you and I, and folk on the other side of the aisle, probably need to make more efforts to actually engage and debate against each other in a sort of civilized manner, even if we fundamentally disagree, even if we don't like each other, but to do so in a civilized manner, rather than what is sort of happening. You got this, I can't remember, is it centrifugal or centripetal? You know, the forces are pushing everybody into their own groups, and I think that does lead to identity politics and erosion of a sense of community. None of these things do I want to be imposed by the state, but I think it's reasonable for libertarians to have a view on civil society and culture, and I'm just a little worried that some of the nice elements, the important elements, the caring elements and the sharing of ideas elements of our civil society and culture have been eroded without us really realizing it.
That's why we're trying to create more freedom societies at universities. It's not because we think everyone should think the way that we think. It's that everyone should be exposed to those ideas and be able to make up their own minds. And that's what, and we have a very successful one at Exeter. I think they would like to get you as well. And they do pints and policy meetings every week, you know, where one of the student members will stand up and probably make some controversial remarks and, you know, should London become an independent city state or something like that, discuss and debate. But they get a big following, and they get a lot of people there. People who wouldn't necessarily be involved in politics, but they hear different ideas. And that's what it's all about. I mean, ultimately, we do not have 100% freedom of speech. Because if I say, if you don't like Mark Littlewood, what you should do, you should go around to his home and with a gun and murder him. Well, that's not an acceptable use of free speech. You'd be pleased to know. But
it doesn't stop lots of people saying it.
But it doesn't. No, it doesn't. But yes, in that respect, you don't have 100%. It's just trying to stop this erosion to the point where, you know, J.K. Rowling, being accused of being transphobic. Because she said, was it in a tweet? There's a name for someone with a womb. It's a woman, and somehow or other that was deemed beyond the pale. That's the sort of thing that concerns me. But we started this conversation off talking about football and the victory of capitalism and the free market, because basically the fans, the supporters, the consumers have won the day, and it's going to have to be the same here. We're going to have to awaken that silent majority, and if there is a backlash, then great, and then we'll win the day. But if people can't be bothered, then we're going to lose.
But let me give you just an optimistic thought or two on that, Andrew. That I think you're seeing, at least on the other side of the Atlantic, but possibly signs of it on this side of the Atlantic, a fan or customer backlash against woke culture in popular entertainment. Great examples of that were the last 3 Star Wars films were painfully woke. You know, all had to be that, you know, white men were all the baddies, and the protagonist had to be a woman, and so on. And it was, you know, that's fine. There's no problem with the protagonist being a woman. It was clearly done for identity politics reasons. To all intents and purposes, they bombed. It was really just too woke for most Star Wars fans to bear. And they didn't lose money, but they didn't make anything like the profit you'd expect the Star Wars franchise to make, and that they just sort of tailed off and died a death. I mean, the 9th and final Star Wars movie, which, you know, it should have been the biggest blockbuster probably of all time, just fell away at the box office. It didn't bankrupt the studio, but it did poorly. Whereas the TV series, The Mandalorian, also set in the Star Wars universe, is a much more rugged, tell it like it is, anti-woke sort of Wild West. That's been a colossal success. One of the shows I love historically in the UK is Doctor Who, but my God, the last series or two has just become a cringe fest of identity politics and wokedom. But it's not just me that thinks that. Its viewing figures are falling off the edge of a cliff compared to when it wasn't woke. So the market will, you know, unless it's just you and me being a bit gammony and nobody agrees with us, but I suspect out there people don't like this sort of woke identity politics sort of culture, and in a whole range of ways, what university they choose to go to, if they go to university at all, what they watch on television, which sort of, whether they join the Freedom Association or start watching IEA stuff, they will start voting effectively with their wallets. And
well, their feet in the wallet. Yeah.
Their feet in their wallets. And I think woke culture and identity politics does not have as much support amongst the market as a whole as it does in the metropolitan liberal elite circles in a few rich parts, largely of London and some other affluent cities.
Well, our time is up, but it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. If people want to learn more about the IEA, where do they go to?
So best jumping on point is the IEA's website, www.iea.org.uk. But a large amount of our content over the lockdown period, and it will continue afterwards, almost every day we put up more video content on our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and look for IEA London, then you'll find, I think it's now well more than 700 videos of interviews, lectures, discussions about economics and political economy. So check out the website. You can sign up to our weekly newsletter there to get our content, or large amounts of our content, for free. Go to YouTube and look for IEA London.
That's brilliant. You've certainly upped your game, haven't you, when it comes to the online stuff? I mean, it's been, but you would never have thought just over a year ago that you'd be doing this much online and putting so many videos on YouTube.
You know, Andrew, you're right. And it's sort of, I think, slightly proved the point I was saying earlier, that necessity can become the mother of invention.
Yeah.
There was nothing stopping us doing YouTube videos 3 years ago. We've had a YouTube channel for 12 years.
Yeah.
But it was only just, oh my God, now we're going to really have to think this through. So we put a lot of efforts in that. And it's great. We're able to get to many thousands of people at pretty low cost. So
it's the same for us as well, Mark. I mean, we don't do much smaller outfits, and we don't do as much as you, but we're putting on regular sort of monthly webinars on top of discussions. I'm doing things like this. And members are saying to me, the members outside of London, well outside of London, people who live in Devon and Cornwall, northwest or the northeast, they're saying, you will continue with this, won't you? Right. Because they want it, because they can't get to London very easily. I have found that some people who do live in London or very close to London say, oh, I'm looking forward to getting back to the physical meetings. Well, yeah, you can understand that, because they used to go into them. But this is certainly something that we're going to continue with as well, because
and same for us. I mean, when we were absolutely same for us, we'll continue with it a lot, and it's been a joy to be a bit less London centric in our audience. Actually, running events at the IEA's offices in Westminster, great, and we will get back to doing those, but you're limited to people who live within 10, 15 or 20 miles of Westminster, and that's a pretty small and slightly peculiar chunk of the population. So yeah, we're going to continue in the same vein, get to people all over the country, indeed all over the planet. We get lots of viewers in India, Indonesia, the United States of America, and elsewhere. So yeah, the IEA is going global. Get on the bandwagon now. And
so's the Freedom Association.
Fantastic.
Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Great to talk to you, Andrew. Look forward to meeting face to face and having a pint soon.
I think we all are, aren't we? Cheers.